Oh, good morning, protege, or of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my lecture, my direct instruction. This is for Monday as we are marching into spring. It's March 14th, 2022. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So at this time, everybody should have, of course, your ISN, open to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper, blue or black pen, multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape. But I will once again respectfully ask every student to refrain from using your correctable tape and your highlighters during the Zoomcast, because again, your primary focus right now is going to be focusing, listening, and taking really good copious notes, not just those main bullet notes, those main ideas. At this juncture in the year, we really need to continue to hone and refine those note-taking skills, and by adding that additional information in terms of oral note-taking. All right, so make certain again in the top right-hand corner, your notes are dated. This is an organizational strategy for success that we've been talking about since the beginning of the school year. And on the top line, you need to write down your topic heading. And we're going to go back to Alger Hiss. And I want to summarize the importance of Alger Hiss and then setting the wheels into motion for other significant events, again, dealing with the Cold War. All right. Now, in order to understand and summarize the importance of Alger Hiss, we've got to go backwards for just a moment. So there's two key players with the Alger Hiss case, actually a third one that I'm going to get to shortly. So number one, this, of course, is Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss worked for the State Department under two American presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president, and, of course, Harry S. Truman, our 33rd president, the president who oversaw the end of World War II, VE Day, VJ Day. And again, as he ushers out one war, unfortunately, he also ushers in another one in the Cold War, which we're learning about right now. So Alger Hiss was accused of basically selling top secret classified information to the Soviet Union. He was basically being accused of being a spy. And being in the State Department, he would have access to this information, this very confidential classified information. Now, on the other hand, here's your other key player. His name is Whittaker Chambers. So Whittaker Chambers was a member of the American Communist Party. For a period of time, he was also spying for the Soviet Union, for Joseph Stalin. Eventually, Whittaker Chambers is going to leave, again, working for the Soviets as a spy. He will renounce his membership into the American Communist Party. And at this point, he actually becomes a writer and a editor, I should say, for Time magazine. And he claims that it was Alger Hiss who had tried to, again, sell or provide Whittaker Chambers top secret classified information from the State Department. Remember, at this point, Whittaker Chambers claimed he was a spy or spying for the Soviet Union. And remember, the top secret classified information was in microfilm that was, again, inserted in a pumpkin or hollow pumpkins in a pumpkin patch in a farm in Maryland that Whittaker Chambers, again, owned. So this is a classic example of he said, he said. So the bottom line is you've got Alger Hiss who says, I don't know what this guy's talking about, this Whittaker Chambers. I don't even know this guy. And the fact that he's accusing me of selling top secret information to the Soviets through him is simply wrong. And then Whittaker Chambers comes out and goes, no, that's not true. That, again, Alger Hiss absolutely was involved in selling this information to the Soviets, and that this is just a sad, tragic event in history. So the question is, whom do you believe? Do you believe, of course, Alger Hiss, or do you believe Whittaker Chambers? All right, so let's continue on. So I'd like you to write this down. So I wanted to, again, kind of set up the parameters in the background in terms of who exactly Alger Hiss was, who is Whittaker Chambers, what was, again, the allegations that were being brought against, again, Alger Hiss, what was he accused of? So the Alger Hiss case was important, and I'm going to give you guys three significant reasons why. So number one, so I have good news and I have not so good news for Alger Hiss. So the good news is Alger Hiss was found not guilty of selling top secret classified government information from the State Department to the Soviet Union. This is called espionage. And espionage, and you should draw a line off to the side to clarify that this is a great example of the importance of good oral note-taking skills. You got to always add that additional information. Espionage is spying. So the good news is, again, Alger Hiss was found not guilty of a very serious crime. By the way, there's only one crime in the Constitution of the United States that is punishable by death, and it's not murder, it's espionage. On the other hand, Alger Hiss was also found, however, guilty of perjury, lying under oath. So basically, they had determined through the testimony that Alger Hiss was lying about his relationship to Whittaker Chambers. So again, the good news is, again, the more serious charge that was dropped, he was acquitted. But on the other hand, he is going to spend a period of time in prison for lying. That's perjury. And I would draw a line to clarify what perjury is. It's lying under oath. And by the way, again, Alger Hiss, till his dying days in the mid-1990s, maintained his innocence until literally the day he died. Alger Hiss said he was just simply nothing but an innocent pawn. He had nothing to do with Whittaker Chambers. He was not secretly selling top secret classified information to the Soviet Union. Again, the question is, whom do you believe? Do you believe Whittaker Chambers or do you believe Alger Hiss? You tell me. Number two, now there was a third key player in the Alger Hiss case. He was actually shown in the video clip that I had shared with you on the previous Zoomcast. So the man who was responsible for overseeing the Hiss investigation, is going to use the Hiss case to basically further his political career. So this guy was an obscure congressman from the great state of California. He became part of what's called the House Un-American Activities Committee. It started out as this obscure committee in the late 1930s, but after World War II had ended, and as we're getting further and further into the Cold War, the House Un-American Activities Committee is going to become more prominent. And this individual, who was a major player in this committee in the House of Reps, is going to make a name for himself during the Alger Hiss hearings. And his name was Richard M. Nixon. So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's a very famous, iconic photograph of Richard Nixon. So Richard Nixon, I'd like you to draw a couple lines off to the side. You need to add this as some oral notes. So Richard Nixon suddenly becomes a very well-known individual as a result of the Alger Hiss case. So what happens is, in 1952, Harry Truman does not seek re-election for the presidency. So now what's going to happen is the Republicans are going to nominate a gentleman by the name of Dwight David Eisenhower. Maybe the name rings a bell. Remember, Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, oversaw the D-Day invasion. Well, he needs a running mate. Who's his running mate? And you should add this as a side note, Richard Nixon. And so Eisenhower ends up defeating the Democratic nominee in the election in 1952. This name might also ring a bell to you. His name was Adlai E. Stevenson. Interesting. So anyway, so Richard Nixon and of course Dwight David Eisenhower win the election of 1952. And then in 1956, Eisenhower runs for re-election. He wins again, once again defeating Adlai E. Stevenson. So for 8 years, Richard Nixon was vice president of the United States. Then we're going to fast forward to 1960. Richard Nixon runs for the presidency. He's the Republican nominee. And the guy he runs against is a man by the name of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, representing the Democratic Party, barely defeats Richard Nixon. Nixon ends up losing the presidency in 1960, kind of disappears for a period of time, resurfaces again, in 1968. Richard Nixon is elected president of the United States of America in 1968. Again, he would be elected as our 37th president. Richard Nixon then is reelected for the presidency in 1972. That's the first election I am cognizant of. I remember as a little boy, Richard Nixon soundly defeated the Democratic nominee, George McGovern. And then we have this whole scandal called the Watergate scandal, which is a long, complicated affair. And time permitting for another Zoomcast, I'll talk about it. But Richard Nixon was accused of covering up some information about this scandal involving, again, the Watergate Hotel. And then in August of 1974, when yours truly was entering into, at that point, 7th grade, Richard Nixon is going to resign as our nation's president of the United States of America because he didn't want to be impeached formally by the House of Representatives as a result of the Watergate scandal. So Richard Nixon is the only American president who ever resigned from office. And this was the photograph, the iconic photograph that was taken when Richard Nixon was leaving the White House in August of 1974, replaced by his vice president, Gerald R. Ford. But the whole rise of Richard Nixon's political career from vice president to president all goes back to Alger Hiss. You see the way I was able to weave all this information together in telling the whole story. And then number 3, the third reason why the Alger Hiss case was important. So again, to summarize, Alger Hiss, good news, he's not found guilty. He's not guilty of espionage, spying, but he is found guilty of perjury, lying under oath, and will spend, again, some time in prison. Will eventually be released until literally the day he died. Alger Hiss maintained his innocence. Richard Nixon is going to use his notoriety as being one of the main players in the House Un-American Activities Committee to further his political career versus vice president under, of course, Dwight David Eisenhower, our 34th president, and then eventually Richard Nixon is elected twice as our nation's 37th president. And then finally, the last reason why the Alger Hiss case is important, because it leads to the beginning of another guy whose political career will skyrocket as a result of what was going on in the beginning of the Cold War. And this gentleman right here is a gentleman by the name of Joseph McCarthy. So here's what I want you to do. I want everybody now to skip a full page, and I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. This is going to be a different topic. So we're now going to move away from Alger Hiss. We're still talking again about the influence of Harry Truman, because this is going to transpire mostly, not exclusively, but mostly when Harry Truman was president. So our topic heading is entitled McCarthyism and the Red Scare. All right, so now we're getting into the third major thing. You really shouldn't call it an accomplishment, I guess, of Harry Truman, but something that his presidency is remembered for. So again, the decision to drop the atomic bomb, that's the biggest, most important thing he's remembered for as president. His impact on the Cold War. We learned about the Alger Hiss case. And now we're going to learn about the rise of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. All right, so let's get into it. Here we go. So there's basically 2 key events that will pave the way for the rise of McCarthyism. And I'm going to explain to you in a little bit what exactly was McCarthyism and the Red Scare. But the way I'm going to do it is through a video clip that I actually discovered last year during the height of the pandemic. And I shared it with your classmates who are now freshmen at Stevenson High School. And I thought that video clip did a great job of encapsulating the essence of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. But in order to get there, we have to first go backwards for a little bit. So number 1, in order to understand what McCarthyism and the Red Scare is, you have to go back again. You see how I'm dovetailing back to a topic I just summarized? You have to go back to Alger Hiss. So again, you have this guy that was in the State Department from the late 1930s, well into the 1940s, served under 2 American presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, and of course, Harry Truman. And Alger Hiss was accused of selling top secret information, classified information to the Soviet Union due to his access in the State Department, the very confidential, very classified information. And as we just learned, Hiss maintained his innocence. He was found not guilty of espionage, but he was found guilty of perjury, lying under oath about his relationship and his friendship, if you will, with Whittaker Chambers. And then there's another important case. And we're going to have a chance later on to talk more about this. I'll go into more depth. And it involves 2 civilians by the name of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this, of course, is Ethel, and this, of course, is Julius Rosenberg. So I'd like you to draw a line off to the side. So why are the Rosenbergs important? Because they are two civilians from New York City, okay, who were accused of selling top secret classified information. Sound familiar? To the Soviet Union. This information was how to build an atomic bomb. Now you have to ask the question, how could two civilians from New York City have access to this very classified information? I will share that with you on another Zoomcast. But the bottom line is I want you to draw a line off to the side. The Rosenbergs were accused of espionage. They were accused of spying. They were put on trial. But unlike Alger Hiss, the Rosenbergs were found guilty of spying, guilty of espionage. And then shortly afterwards, the Rosenbergs were both executed as a result of being convicted of spying. And again, I'll go into more detail in another Zoomcast later on about the Rosenbergs, but make certain again you added some additional information because you might be seeing them on your next assessment. All right, let's continue on. So what happens is this. On one hand, you got a little bit of Alger Hiss, okay? And let's imagine we're metaphorically speaking, we're baking a cake and you have your ingredients. You have a little bit of Alger Hiss. Then we're going to add in another ingredient, and that's the Rosenbergs. Again, what do they all have in common? What's the common denominator? Is, again, alleged spying for the Soviet Union, selling top secret information to the Soviets. So now, by the time you get to the early 1950s, from 1950 through 1953 into 1954, there is now a growing fear in the United States. And the fear is communism, driven by the Soviet Union, promoted by, of course, Joseph Stalin, our evil, remember we talked about him, the evil dictator of the Soviet Union, former ally of the United States when we had a common enemy in Adolf Hitler. But once Adolf Hitler was defeated, again, why do we support Stalin? Why do we want Stalin to be our friend again during World War II? Classic saying, the enemy of my enemy is my best friend. But now that Hitler is gone, we are no longer BFFs with, of course, Joseph Stalin. So now there's this growing fear. This actually started to percolate back in 1945, but really between 1950 and 1953, even into 1954, there's this growing fear that communists are taking over the federal government. And this is essence, or in essence, I should say, and I would draw a line off to the side, that's really what McCarthyism is. It's this fear that we are going to lose our way of life, our freedoms, our democracy, our economic system of capitalism and free enterprise, and that we would be taken over by the Soviet Union through communism. That really is McCarthyism and the Red Scare. So who's the key player? It's got to be this guy. His name was Joseph McCarthy. So Joseph McCarthy, ladies and gentlemen, was born way back in 1908, passed away in 1957. He was a Republican from our neighbors to the north, Wisconsin. And again, when he was first elected, unless you were from Wisconsin, most people had never even heard of Joseph McCarthy. But just like Richard Nixon, McCarthy, or Senator McCarthy, is going to make a name for himself through, again, targeting this fear that's permeating throughout the United States that communism was taking over, making that strong connection. And by the way, I would add another little side note. Another reason why Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism and the Red Scare is going to become increasingly more dominant in terms of people's thoughts and conversations, and why Richard Nixon became increasingly more well-known and renowned during the Alger Hiss case, or the Hiss hearings, I should say. And I would mention the growing new medium called television. So in the early 1950s, television is slowly beginning to replace radio as the main means of people not only gaining their entertainment, but also their information. So again, you were able to, your great-grandparents were able to sit around their living room and watch on their little black and white television, again, Joseph McCarthy making these allegations about communism taking over the federal government. So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, take a good look at this photograph. Oh, you'll definitely be seeing him not only on the next progress check, but on the Unit 5 mastery exam on the Cold War. And this is the guy that really dominates American politics and dominates a lot of conversations throughout the United States of America. And this, of course, is Joseph McCarthy, senator, one of our 2 senators from the great state of Wisconsin, our neighbors to the north. All right, so a little more background information. 1950, this is really where it all starts with Joseph McCarthy. And again, taking advantage of this growing, and I'm going to keep using this word again and again and again to hammer it home, fear. This fear that communism, driven by the Soviet Union, an evil dictator, former ally, now bitter opponent, bitter enemy, Joseph Stalin, is trying to take over the United States. But again, not necessarily militarily, but again, through, political and economic means, more political. So in 1950, Joseph McCarthy, this obscure senator from the great state of Wisconsin, using television, is going to come out and make a wild claim. He claims that he has a list of 205 State Department officials. Alger Hiss was a member of the State Department, and he claims that all of them were communists. We call them red communists because red is often associated with communism, because if you go back to the Soviet Union's founding in 1922 by Vladimir Lenin, what was the primary color? And the answer is red. So that's the connection. Now, the question is this allegation true? We're going to find out. So between 1950 through 1953, McCarthyism and this fear that communism is taking over the United States of America, driven by the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, is going to increasingly grow in popularity. I told you, again, the role of television, McCarthy using both tapping into the fear that the American people are experiencing and using this new medium of television really, again, promotes and furthers his own political career. So McCarthyism is going to grow in popularity for a couple of reasons. Number one reason why McCarthyism, this fear of communism, is going to permeate throughout the United States is this fear, no, that's not the right word, a frustration that America is experiencing over what's called the Korean War. So in 1950, the United States becomes involved in a civil war on the peninsula of Korea. There's now 2 Koreas. There's North Korea, South Korea. North Korea, dominated by the communists, driven, of course, and aided by primarily China, which had turned communist a couple years earlier. Remember the Red Revolution in China, Mao Zedong. And the southern part of Korea, or South Korea, dominated by democracy. So the United States is going to get involved with this affair. And again, they're trying to prevent communism from taking over the whole Korean peninsula. So I'll go into much more detail on the Korean War later on when we talk about the presidency of Dwight David Eisenhower. But one other thing about the Korean War, and you should draw a line off to the side. Again, another example of some good oral note taking. It really should be called the Korean conflict, because Congress never officially declared war on Korea in terms of getting involved. We just started to send more and more military support to the South Koreans. So technically, I wouldn't grade it down on you if you were to write Korean War, but technically it's the Korean conflict. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to come back to those notes in a moment. I want everybody now to skip a full page. Don't continue on. This is a new set of notes. Don't go to the back, a new set of notes. Go to the right side. Once again, I want everybody to date your notes, top right-hand corner for March 14th, 2022. And I want you to write down for me guide questions. What is McCarthyism? So again, this is the video that I found last year for last year's 8th graders, now freshmen at Adelaide East Stevenson High School. Yes, your high school that you'll be eventually attending is named after the gentleman who lost twice, 1952 and 1956, to Republican candidate Dwight David Eisenhower. So this video clip, I think, does a wonderful job of encapsulating and tying together everything I've just shared with you about McCarthyism and the Red Scare. So I'm going to go through these guide questions quickly, knowing that you can pause at any time when again, if you're having difficulty keeping up, and that's fine. Remember to skip a couple lines between every guide question. Number one, based on the video clip, I want you to explain for me in even more detail. I've kind of given you an overview, but now I really want you to explain for me what was or what is McCarthyism. Skip a couple lines. Number two, what role did the American Communist Party play in the 1930s and the 1940s? Remember, this is again how we tie together this information. And I'm dovetailing back to, remember our old friend Whittaker Chambers? He was a member of the American Communist Party, claimed that it was Alger Hiss that was selling Whittaker Chambers information, classified information that Chambers would eventually disseminate to the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin. Next guy question. Who in America were targeted as communists? What groups? Who was J. Edgar Hoover, a very important player whose career actually goes back to the Roaring 20s? Next guy question. What role did our old friend Richard M. Nixon, remember I talked about him earlier in the Alger Hiss case? So tell me about the roles more specifically that Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy played in the rise of McCarthyism. And again, I'm going through these guide questions quickly because I know you can pause it. And that's the one thing that all of you have done a great job of, is I love the way you've paced yourselves and pausing the Zoomcast and giving yourself a chance to get caught up. That's why I love this tiered type of instruction. Next guide question. What event turned public opinion against Joseph McCarthy? And what eventually happened to Joseph McCarthy based on this video clip? And what is or what was the importance of McCarthyism and the Red Scare from 1950 through 1953, and then by 1954, McCarthyism basically runs its course. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this video clip is a bit lengthy. It's about 5 minutes and 40 seconds long, but it's well worth it. It does a wonderful job of encapsulating the essence of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Here we go.
Imagine that one day you're summoned before a government panel. Even though you haven't committed any crime or been formally charged with one, you are repeatedly questioned about your political views, accused of disloyalty, and asked to incriminate your friends and associates. If you don't cooperate, you risk jail or losing your job. This is exactly what happened in the United States in the 1950s, as part of a campaign to expose suspected communists. Named after its most notorious practitioner, the phenomenon known as McCarthyism destroyed thousands of lives and careers. For over a decade, American political leaders trampled democratic freedoms in the name of protecting them. During the 1930s and 1940s, there had been an active but small communist party in the United States. Its record was mixed. While it played crucial roles in wider progressive struggles for labor and civil rights, it also supported the Soviet Union. From the start, the American Communist Party faced attacks from conservatives and business leaders, as well as from liberals who criticized its ties to the oppressive Soviet regime. During World War II, when the USA and USSR were allied against Hitler, some American communists actually spied for the Russians. When the Cold War escalated and this espionage became known, domestic communism came to be seen as a threat to national security. But the attempt to eliminate that threat soon turned into the longest lasting and most widespread episode of political repression in American history. Spurred on by a network of bureaucrats, politicians, journalists, and businessmen, the campaign wildly exaggerated the danger of communist subversion. The people behind it harassed anyone suspected of holding left-of-center political views or associating with those who did. If you hung modern art on your walls, had a multiracial social circle, or signed petitions against nuclear weapons, you might just have been a communist. Starting in the late 1940s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the resources of his agency to hunt down such supposed communists and eliminate them from any position of influence within American society. And the narrow criteria that Hoover and his allies used to screen federal employees spread to the rest of the country. Soon, Hollywood studios, universities, car manufacturers, and thousands of other public and private employers were imposing the same political tests on the men and women who worked for them. Meanwhile, Congress conducted its own witch hunt, subpoenaing hundreds of people to testify before investigative bodies like the House Un-American Activities Committee. If they refused to cooperate, they could be jailed for contempt, or, more commonly, fired and blacklisted. Ambitious politicians like Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy used such hearings as a partisan weapon, accusing Democrats of being soft on communism and deliberately losing China to the communist bloc. McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, became notorious by flaunting ever-changing lists of alleged communists within the State Department. Egged on by other politicians, he continued to make outrageous accusations while distorting or fabricating evidence. Many citizens reviled McCarthy, while others praised him. And when the Korean War broke out, McCarthy seemed vindicated. Once he became chair of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in 1953, McCarthy's recklessness increased. It was his investigation of the Army that finally turned public opinion against him and diminished his power. McCarthy's colleagues in the Senate censured him, and he died less than 3 years later, probably from alcoholism. McCarthyism ended as well. It had ruined hundreds, if not thousands, of lives and drastically narrowed the American political spectrum. Its damage to democratic institutions would be long-lasting. In all likelihood, there were both Democrats and Republicans who knew that the anti-communist purges were deeply unjust, but feared that directly opposing them would hurt their careers. Even the Supreme Court failed to stop the witch hunt, condoning serious violations of constitutional rights in the name of national security. Was domestic communism an actual threat to the American government? Perhaps, though a small one. But the reaction to it was so extreme that it caused far more damage than the threat itself. And if new demagogues appeared in uncertain times to attack unpopular minorities in the name of patriotism, could it all happen again?
Couple of observations. Number one, again, when I loved how the narrator talked about, again, demagogues and, playing off of fears. Who's the ultimate demagogue that played off the fears of the German people in the 1920s or early into the 1930s? And the answer was Adolf Hitler. Now, I'm not certainly comparing Adolf Hitler with Joseph Stalin. That's an absolutely unfair comparison. But in terms of the idea of being a public speaker that preys on people's fears and emotions, that's the connection between how Hitler was able to rise to power in Germany and eventually seize power, and what Joseph McCarthy was trying to do to further his own political career. Observation number two, I love the word that they mentioned, the narrator mentioned, subversion. Subversion, trying to undermine our political way of doing things, undermine our democracy, undermine, our economic system of capitalism and free enterprise. And again, from McCarthy's point of view, were these charges, again, was there any accuracy or truth to it? No, that's what was mentioned in the video clip. These were wild allegations. Was there really a threat from communism in the United States? And I agree with the video clip. A very, very, very small minority. But more importantly, it's the fear and these reckless and wild allegations. That's really what impacted people in the 1950s, between 1950 through 1953, pretty much wrapping up in 1954, when Joseph McCarthy was censored by the United States Senate, which basically ended his political career. And the final comment was, again, dovetailing back to Richard Nixon and the role that Nixon played with, again, they mentioned it, the House Un-American Activities Committee, huge in the, again, early 1950s. So I would like everybody to now go back to the previous page because we're going to get back to our direct instructional notes. All right. So now the year is 1950. 1954. So for the last 3 years, and especially in 1953, I would argue that Joseph McCarthy was the second most powerful person in America after the President of the United States of America. He not only played off the fears, you notice I keep saying that word again and again and again. There's a reason for it, but also using television as the new medium and means of gaining support. So in 1954, Senator McCarthy is going to appear on television. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. So number one, so if you remember several years earlier, way back in 1950, Joseph McCarthy claimed that he had this list of all these members of the United States State Department that he claimed were all communists and working and were in cahoots with the Soviet Union. There was no list. He was simply making up. It was being fabricated. So now Joseph McCarthy takes it to another level. So now he goes after a much bigger fish. And that big fish is the United States Army. And so now he accuses the Army of, quote, coddling communists, little alliteration, coddling, taking care of, if you will. Again, not really coming out and saying it, but inferring that communism is now infiltrated, again, American armed services, more specifically, the United States Army. But that takes me to my second point, number two. Because in 1954, and we're going to learn more about this guy later on, his presidency. We already learned about him in World War II as Supreme Allied Commander and overseeing Operation Overlord, which of course was the D-Day invasion. But now you have not General Dwight David Eisenhower, you now have President Dwight David Eisenhower. And when Joseph McCarthy, the junior senator from the great state of Wisconsin, comes out and accuses the United States Army of coddling communists, this is where Ike takes action. Now remember, Ike is the president of the United States. I'm using his nickname. Eisenhower is the president of the United States, but still has a very strong connection with the United States Army. He had been a career soldier going back to World War I. So what happens is Eisenhower orders a full-scale investigation of Joseph McCarthy's, again, allegations that the United States Army was, quote, coddling communists. So as these hearings were taking place in 1954, the United States Army had determined that the charges of, again, these allegations that the Army was coddling communists were baseless. Baseless meaning there's no fact to it. It was erroneous. It was fraudulent. They were lies. Number two, but the other brilliant thing that Eisenhower did was these hearings in 1954 were broadcasted on television. So remember how I said how Joseph McCarthy used television to make a name for himself? Well, now television is going to destroy Joseph McCarthy's political career. So now Joseph McCarthy doesn't come across as some kind of American patriots like that guy, but rather he comes across as a bully. And now suddenly people are starting to see Joseph McCarthy for what he was. And we're going to call him out. Joseph McCarthy was a fraud. All these wild allegations about communists taking over the State Department and communism infiltrating the United States Army, there was no evidence to back it up. He was just making these wild allegations to basically promote and further his own political career. And now I want to introduce to you another key player. So there were really two guys that really helped expose Joseph McCarthy. One was, of course, Dwight David Eisenhower, our 34th president of the United States. And I'll be talking about Eisenhower as we wrap up the Cold War later on. But the other key player was a gentleman by the name of Edward R. Murrow. And I definitely want you to draw a line or two off this side because you're going to need to add some information about him. So Edward R. Murrow was America's most respected journalist and broadcaster. If you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, take a good look at him. This was the guy that America trusted for their news. So Edward R. Murrow, you should draw a line off the side, started out in radio. As a matter of fact, he was first broadcasting live during the Blitz in the Battle of Britain. And then later on, we'll make the transition from radio to television, working for, of course, if you look at the call letters, CBS. So I'd like to, as we're wrapping up McCarthyism for today, we're not done quite yet with McCarthyism. I want to share with you another video clip. And this video clip is entitled Joseph Welch versus Joseph McCarthy. So in this particular video clip, I want to share with you a couple of some key players. So number one of the key players is a guy by the name of Roy Cohn. So Roy Cohn was the chief counsel. He was the chief legal advisor. He was a lawyer that basically worked with and supported Joseph McCarthy when Joseph McCarthy was making these wild allegations of communism taking over first the State Department and then later on the United States Army. So during the McCarthy hearings, Joseph McCarthy had decided to target a young man. His name was Fred Fisher. Fred Fisher was a lawyer. He was a lawyer that was trained at Harvard. He went to Harvard University. He became part of another gentleman's law firm. His name, of course, was Jack Welch. So Joseph McCarthy was basically accusing Mr. Fisher, who was part of a guild is kind of a labor union, if you will, for lawyers, of basically this guild was, again, according to Joseph McCarthy, known for communists or being communists. So Jack Welch decided to come forward during some of these McCarthy hearings that were going on television, and he basically wanted to call out Joseph McCarthy for what he was. And I want you to watch this clip. This is actual footage of Jack Welch, one of the few people besides Edward R. Murrow and President Dwight D. Eisenhower who was really to stand up to one of the ultimate bullies of the 20th century, and that was Senator Joseph McCarthy. So here we go. I want you to watch this clip.
Chairman. May I say that Mr. Wells talked about this being cruel and reckless. He was just baiting, he has been baiting Mr. Cohn here for hours, requesting that Mr. Cohn before sundown get out of any department of the government anyone who was serving the communist cause. Now, I just give this man's record, and I want to say, Mr. Welch, that it has been labeled long before he became a member, as early as 1944.
Senator, may we not drop this? We know he belongs to the Lawyers Guild. And Mr. Cohn nods his head at me. I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cohn.
No, sir.
I meant to do you no personal injury. And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I just love that powerful line. Have you no sense of decency? As Joseph McCarthy was, again, going after this young lawyer, again, who was part of the Lawyers Guild and accusing him of being a communist. And here was Jack Welch, again, the lawyer with that same firm that Fred Fisher was part of, coming out and basically calling out Joseph McCarthy. So this is during those Army hearings of 1954. So the average American who's in their living room watching this on TV is watching, this is Joseph McCarthy right here. And suddenly he's not looking so much like a patriot anymore. Now he's coming across as what he was, a bully, and ultimately a fraud. All right, so as we wrap this up, I want to summarize McCarthyism. So I want to mention again, McCarthyism. And I was thinking about this. McCarthyism, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the Salem witchcraft trials of the mid-1600s, when young girls were accused in Salem, Massachusetts, of practicing witchcraft and consorting with black magic. And there was this hysteria that swept through the village of Salem, Massachusetts. And there were hearings that were held and wild allegations. And sadly, several of these young girls ended up being executed, but these allegations were baseless. And it reminds me in that regards of McCarthyism. And what does it remind me of? Playing off of people's fears. There's that word that I keep using again and again and again. preying on people's fears. And that's exactly what Senator Joseph McCarthy was doing. So the rise of McCarthyism was important. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons why. So number 1, so first of all, you have to go back, dovetail back to what I said earlier. There were 2 key players, and yes, we have to give a nod, of course, to Jack Welch, who in 1954 basically called out Joseph McCarthy. And, again, I'm paraphrasing, have you no shame, sir? Have you no sense of decency? And really now people are starting to look at Joseph McCarthy from a very different perspective. But it really was due to the work of 2 individuals. Number 1, Dwight David Eisenhower, who recognized, by the way, privately, and you might want to make a little side note off to the side. He never said this publicly, but privately, Dwight David Eisenhower told some of his confidants that Joseph McCarthy's wild allegations, his demagoguery, preying on people's fears, it reminded him of Hitler. That was why I mentioned Hitler earlier. Not to say that Joseph McCarthy was calling for the genocide of a group of people, but again, demagoguery, playing off of people's fears. That's what Hitler did, and that's what Joseph McCarthy was doing. And that's why Eisenhower said in 1954, Senator Joseph McCarthy must be stopped and he must be exposed. So I always used to say that it was almost like, again, President Dwight David Eisenhower was putting on his general cap again and becoming General Eisenhower. And again, you have to give credit to Edward R. Murrow, America's most trusted, again, journalist and broadcaster, who in his nightly broadcasts, especially at the height of McCarthyism, appealed to the American people to really see who Joseph McCarthy really was. And so in 1954, as was mentioned in the video clip, the United States Senate is going to formally censor Joseph McCarthy. And again, censor means you're formally criticizing or condemning him. And when he was censored in 1954, and I would draw a line off to the side, that pretty much ends the political career. And I would go so far as to say the reign of terror of Joseph McCarthy. Because as we're going to find out in my next Zoomcast, Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism and the Red Scare destroyed hundreds and thousands of lives. So as I wrap up my Zoomcast, I want to leave you with a final video clip. So I want you to skip 2 full pages. I want you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make certain, again, you date your notes one more time. Of course, it is March 14th, 2022. It's Monday, everybody. And I want you to write down for me guide questions, good nights, and good luck. So this is a video clip from a movie that came out many, many years ago, and it really focused on America's most trusted journalist, of course, not Joseph McCarthy, excuse me, Edward R. Murrow. So I'm going to share one of the clips from the movies. This is one of the seminal broadcasts of Edward R. Murrow, basically calling out Joseph McCarthy and attempting to expose him to the American people. So here we go. Here's some guide questions. Number 1, what word did Edward R. Murrow repeat and emphasize again and again and again during this broadcast? Number 2, what exactly Edward R. Murrow claimed that this was not the time to do what? He was issuing a challenge in a good way to the American people. And then finally, number 3, whom did Edward R. Murrow blame for the rise of Joseph McCarthy, McCarthyism, and the Red Scare? So at the end of course, the name of this movie is Good Night and Good Luck. And at the end of every broadcast of Edward R. Murrow, that was his signature closing. I always say to my students, think history. Edward R. Murrow's famous line was good night and good luck. So ladies and gentlemen, here we go.
We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men, not from men who feared to write, to associate, to speak, and to defend the causes that were for the moment unpopular. This is no time for men who oppose Senator McCarthy's methods to keep silent, or for those who approve. We can deny our heritage and our history, but we cannot escape responsibility for the results. We proclaim ourselves, indeed, as we are, the defenders of freedom wherever it continues to exist in the world. But we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night, and good luck.
And again, because of these nightly broadcasts of Edward R. Murrow trying to point out again and expose, again, Senator Joseph McCarthy to the American people, Joseph McCarthy, and I would go so far as to call it a reign of terror, will come to an end. And I love, again, how he kept emphasizing the word fear. And that ties in, again, when, again, President Dwight D. Eisenhower never said this publicly, but privately accused Joseph McCarthy of being a demagogue, like Adolf Hitler. Because what is it that Adolf Hitler and Joseph McCarthy both shared in common was, again, tapping into people's fear in order to advance their own political careers. So that's it for today's Zoomcast. So what I'm going to do is for my next Zoomcast, I'm going to go back and I'm going to summarize the other reasons why Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism in the Red Scare are important. And then I'm going to continue on talking about some other accomplishments of our first Cold War president, and that's Harry Truman. So at this time, I would like everybody to take out your highlighters and your correctable tape. Take your correctable tape and please clean up anything that's crossed out or traced over. Remember, your ISN, your history notebook, is a portfolio of your absolute best effort. Multiple colored highlighters, tip of the tip. Focus again on those words you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and things, but you're not done. You need to go back and review your ISN 10 to 15 minutes every single day. You practice for soccer, you practice for football, you practice for basketball. Why aren't you practicing for school every day? It's no different. If you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to your mom or dad or somebody in your house, or maybe do a Zoom session or a FaceTime session with a classmate, and you channel your inner Mr. Bonk. You teach that person or persons about, again, who was Alger Hiss? What was he accused of? Who was Whitaker Chambers? Remember, I dovetailed back again. Who was Joseph McCarthy? What was McCarthyism and the Red Scare? What was Joseph McCarthy accusing the State Department and the United States Army of? What negative emotion did Joseph McCarthy, as a demagogue, excuse me, tap into? And then finally, what roles did President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and again, America's most respected journalist and broadcaster, Edward R. Murrow, what roles did both of these individuals play in exposing Joseph McCarthy to the American people, and what eventually happened to Joseph McCarthy in 1954? So again, I hope everybody enjoyed my Zoomcast as much as I love making it. Again, I think it's just wonderful that everybody is able to work at your own pace and hopefully learn a little something more about the Cold War. So as I always like to say, as I wrap up one of my Zoomcasts, you know, the story may have ended today, but you better believe the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.